All right, so welcome to the very first episode of the APPA, the American Philosophical Practitioners Association Book Club. We'll be meeting roughly once a month. That could be 3 weeks, 5 weeks, depending on people's schedules. The next one will actually be in about 3 weeks and a day. Michael Picard will be coming here on September 22. And then the next one is 5 weeks later, this kind of thing. But my name is Rick Repetti. I am vice president of one of the vice presidents of the APPA, and I'm the host for this book club series for now. It takes a lot of work to put it together and find people who are willing to come here, like our first guest today, who I'm very happy to be able to introduce in a moment. This is Aleksandar Fatic, who on my screen, his window's right below mine, but it might not be that way on yours. Once he and I start talking, I'm going to change it so that he and I are in the center. But for now, we'll just leave it a little more informally. So I don't know, did I mention that Aleksandar is more affectionately known as Sasha? That's how I met him in Romania at the ICPP, the International Conference on Philosophical Practice, last summer in Timisoara, Romania. And I hope to meet him again next summer, closer to his home at Zagreb in Croatia. I believe he's closer to that than to Romania. What else do I want to say? So I'm going to give a formal intro, like pretty much reading Sasha's bio. Then I want to make a couple of comments of my own about the book, just to kind of highlight something that I found very fascinating in the book. Then I have a bunch of standard questions that I'm going to ask Sasha. They'll pretty much be the same kinds of questions that we ask most of our guests, but they might spontaneously come up other things in our discussion. But we're going to spend roughly half the time together. We're here for an hour and a half, so it could be 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how it goes, just with me interviewing Sasha. And then for the second half, or the remaining half hour, however long that is, we'll open it up to audience Q&A. So hold on to your questions for now, and then later when we turn to Q&A, I'll try and keep notes on who raised their hand first. And when we get to that stage, you'll just kind of, use the little icon to raise your computer hand or raise your actual hand. And I'll try to keep track of who asked questions first. We got a lot more people who signed up for this, so I expect that people will be popping in after we already began. But before we begin, any questions from anyone else about the formality here? It's good to see some names and some faces that I know. So Aleksandar Fatic was born in Bosnia and Herzegovina, went to school and studied in Serbia, Czech Republic, Australia, and spent large swaths of his teaching career in the UK and various European countries. He's now a professor at the University of Belgrade in Serbia, based at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, and at the same time he coordinates the National Association of Philosophical Practitioners, the Institute for Practical Humanities, IPH, where in addition to philosophical counseling, he is busy training psychotherapists in the particular philosophically informed modality of psychotherapy called modal integrative psychotherapy. This is the type of psychotherapy formerly designed by Aleksandar and developed by his colleagues at IPH, one that shifts the methodological and logical foundations of traditional psychotherapy from the implicit reliance on propositional and binary logic to modal logic, which is the logic of possibility, necessity, and that sort of thing. The philosophy behind this modality is perhaps what best describes Aleksandar's understanding of the humanities in general and philosophy in particular, and that's the need to undermine the existing foundations, which are binary, in order to build new structure, or to question and shake the existing modal world or possible world in which we find ourselves, in order to build a new one or to jump to an alternative context where what's impossible in the current modal world becomes possible, and vice versa. Aleksandar is the author of numerous books and articles in a variety of publications and with different publishers. He's currently finishing a manuscript on the philosophical role of artificial intelligence in psychotherapy. I'm curious about that. Focusing on whether AI can acquire a semblance of psychotherapeutic subjecthood for the client, given the various criteria of psychotherapeutic transfer, countertransfer, and other dynamic relationships that depend on the subjecthood of both the psychotherapist and the client. His book, which is today's topic, Virtue as Identity, Emotions and the Moral Personality, is his conceptually most important work, which offers principles that determine his work in applied philosophy generally. Okay, so that's my intro to him based on basically a bio. Like I said, I'd like to preface my questions to Aleksandar, or Sasha, with just a few remarks of my own about some things in his book that really impressed me, and which I'd like to highlight or make salient or emphasize for many, if not most of the members of our audience today, who happen to be either philosophical counselors, philosophical consultants, or philosophical practitioners, as well as those in any of the mental health professions. Most of you already know this, but maybe you don't. In Plato's Republic, Plato has Socrates as the mouthpiece for Plato's vision of an ideal society, which vision he offers as an answer to moral skepticism and nihilism under challenge. Plato famously compares the individual or the soul on the one hand and the society or the state on the other hand, and he uses his analysis of the range of better and worse societies or states on the big picture side of the analogy that's supposed to be more intuitively recognizable and understandable to us, discernible because of how big its contours are. Sorry, I lost my place. In order to facilitate our ability to see the same sort of analysis of better and worse individuals or souls, which the moral skeptic or nihilist apparently does not already recognize. And Plato argues basically that a well-ordered, harmonious, flourishing society has a certain optimal structure in which each major component of society plays its appropriate role. Lawgivers, enlightened lawgivers, law enforcement, and law-abiding citizens who are also the consumers and the producers. But in a failing society, this order is lost, and that a similar relationship may be seen in a well-ordered, harmonious, flourishing individual soul, and its absence in an unhealthy individual. In this impressive book, Sasha reverses the analogy and reasons generally from what constitutes mental health, sanity, and moral health or virtue in the individual, and projects the same principles and considerations from the analysis of the mentally healthy and unhealthy or morally vicious or virtuous and vicious individual to that of the healthy or unhealthy society. Countless times throughout the book, he's reasoning in this way, which is incredibly interesting and insightful and revealing in the ways that analogies are supposed to get you to see something you didn't originally see. It had that effect on me, and I'm really appreciative for that. Of particular interest to me, and one of the reasons why I'm mentioning this, I imagine to others here interested in the relationship between philosophical counseling and psychotherapy, is the extent to which Sasha's many brilliant insights and arguments appear to rest on his insider's knowledge of both modalities. While there are dozens of fascinating examples of this in the text, it's not the only thing of interest here. But before we dive into the text with Sasha's help in my questioning him about the text, I'd like to first ask him a few questions about him, the formation of his identity as philosopher, philosophical counselor, and then author of the text. All right, so just give me a second here, folks, to get my screen back the way I want it to look. Here. Okay. All right, so it's my great pleasure to introduce you, Sasha, and it's good to see you again. Welcome. Thanks for coming. We really appreciate it. And it's great to have you as our first person. I think you certainly will make a big splash as the first guest here, and this is just a great way to inaugurate this new series. So thank you for agreeing to come.
Thank you very much, Vic, and thanks everyone who's here this evening. I see some familiar faces. Thank you very much for being here. So I hope we'll be able to at least bring up some issues that are relevant to our current work.
Yeah, yeah. And, it's late in the evening for you. That's another reason for us to appreciate your willingness to come here. If it's 4 o'clock now, what is it, 10, 11 o'clock where you are, something like that?
It's the 10:15 here, and it's been an interesting day because this is a part of the world where some things that you would normally take for granted still don't come as easily as you might expect. We've just had major demonstrations in the streets against the government,
Oh,
uh,
boy.
and basically the human rights activists have just staged a very serious protest, which was in defense of the political activists for ecological activists who have been arrested and who have been the target of the government repression. So it's been an exciting day.
Wow, I remember discussing that kind of activism last summer when we were in the restaurant with, I forget, some of your colleagues were enlightening me about what the dynamics were in that situation. All right. Well, this is not as maybe not as pressing or exciting, but so tell us a little bit about yourself. Starting with, how did you get into philosophy?
Well, philosophy has been one of those things that in my life, in my personal history, it's been one of those things that you don't really think about too much. It's been almost a destiny, almost, you know, what Turks call kismet, fate. So I basically simply let myself go. Since I was a young student, a high school student, I basically had no dilemmas. As soon as I got in touch with philosophy, it became the sort of type of life of choice. It became sort of the direction of life which I never later questioned. So it was something like, answering that question for me is something like answering the question of how did you learn to swim? I mean, I don't really remember when and how, but it came naturally.
Well, that's an interesting answer. I've never quite heard that answer before, and I've questioned many philosophers over the course of my career. How did you get there? I like that answer. That's kind of built into your nature. I'm not surprised after reading your work, because your work seems to be coming out of. It's ironic that the title of your book is Virtue as Identity. It seems that this comes right out of your identity. So there's a consistency between you as theorist and as person. And it's the kind of thing that I think you're advocating for. And so I think you represent that very well. All right. So a little bit more specifically, and this, I don't know if we'll get the same answer, but how did you get into philosophical practice, philosophical counseling, psychotherapy, all this sort of thing?
Yes, well, philosophical counseling came to me as an answer to my personal dilemmas and difficulties at a certain stage in my life. When it was one of those convergences between one's profession and one's individual personal experiences. And this was a situation where basically doing philosophy, which always for me involved asking questions about the actual use of philosophy and the application of philosophy to real life, sort of collided with major issues in my life. And then philosophical counseling sort of became the way in which philosophy articulated itself in my mind as a way of me spontaneously responding to the challenges that life had placed in front of me. Uh, so philosophical counseling, yes, there was a personal reason, and I believe with most psychotherapists and philosophical counselors that I've had a chance to talk to, the situation might be similar. I mean, there was a personal reason for me to become involved in philosophical counseling and to become interested in psychotherapy because I was facing relationships, personal situations which required elucidation from that side and which required answers that philosophy in its theoretical guise alone could not offer.
Yeah, interesting. So are you saying that you had to figure out how to make practical any wisdom that you had been previously exposed to in philosophy, which is usually theoretical, and apply it to solve personal challenges? Yeah? And you did
Yes.
this for yourself first, and then you realized the value of it. Is that how it happened?
Yes, yes. Basically, my way of living philosophy was academic. I was teaching philosophy. And teaching philosophy does involve an element of philosophical practice, obviously, in terms of developing relationship with the students. And it's always a value-laden relationship, which involves a kind of leadership, which is not strictly academic, and always involves those elements of, personal transference and all these elements that you see in a purer form in the psychotherapeutic relationship. But that philosophy did not have that kind of doing philosophy did not have the capacity to actually help me deal with the stress of my life, which I faced at that particular point in my life. And gradually, as I was turning to philosophical counseling and exploring the limits of philosophical counseling and sort of feeling for what philosophical counseling really is, where the edges are of philosophical counseling, where it borders with the philosophy of psychiatry, where it borders with applied ethics and other related areas, feeling that terrain allowed me to sort of feel my way through my problems. So my sort of overcoming, my living through, my surviving my own personal crisis sort of coincided with my negotiating that terrain towards philosophical counseling. So having emerged from that life crisis alive and relatively normal, right? I also emerged as someone who was primarily interested in philosophical counseling.
Fascinating. I'm curious, this is a kind of tangent off of that question, but I should probably build this into my list of questions, and I apologize for not alerting you in advance of this one, but I'm sure if anybody can give a quick and easy answer to it, it would be you. How would you differentiate between philosophical counseling and psychotherapy?
Well, the whole idea of this modal integrative psychotherapy, which I've developed, is an attempt at the answer to that question. I'm not really sure whether we can convincingly distinguish between philosophical counseling and psychotherapy, and I'm not really sure that there is a way in which we could say that some kind of psychotherapy is not philosophical counseling. In my experience, it turns out that most types of psychotherapeutic interventions do represent a kind of philosophical counseling, but the persons who see themselves as primarily or exclusively psychotherapists are often not aware of that. So to me, philosophical counseling is the overarching conceptual context within which psychotherapy takes place. And it seems to me that every psychotherapy is, in fact, philosophical counseling, whereas not every type of philosophical counseling is psychotherapy. Philosophical counseling is the broader context within which psychotherapy takes place. And this basically means that you can adopt a practical philosophical view of life, of a particular discipline, of a particular activity, of human relationships, of political philosophy, whatever. And then you can build various psychotherapeutic methodologies within that broad applied philosophical framework. And that framework can be defined as a framework of philosophical practice and philosophical counseling in particular. Whereas any psychotherapeutic intervention that attempts to be devoid of philosophical content, of philosophical counseling, ultimately faces all those familiar dilemmas, whether it's science, in what ways it does not satisfy the methodological criteria of science, whether it faces this problem of identity as soon as it divulges itself from philosophy.
Yeah, listening to your answer, I'm reminded that your answer is a thread running throughout many of the different arguments in the book when you compare sanity and moral health and stuff like that, and how overlapping and how hard one is necessary but insufficient for the other, and all this. So you have a wealth of analyses in the book that are extensions of what you just said. So for that reason, I would encourage, I know many people in the audience always struggle with differentiating between these two things. So this is a plug for the book, folks. read the book, and you'll get a lot of ammunition for your conversation with people who challenge you about this as a philosophical counselor, and what's the difference between that and therapy. All right, so scoping out a little bit, what's been going on in your career? Big picture. What have you been working on recently? That's really two versions of the same question.
Yes, well, I'm sort of as I get older, I'm going back to the classics increasingly. So I'm sort of trying at the moment, apart from those projects that you mentioned, reading my bio, I'm sort of increasingly drawn to trying to see at present to trying to see how some of the classics, especially the neglected classics of modern philosophy, it could be interpreted as valuable sources of psychotherapeutic insight and philosophical counseling insight, especially Arthur Schopenhauer. So I'm currently working on Schopenhauer, and I'm trying to re-examine the world as will and representation as a source of basically psychotherapeutically not only informed but intended ideas, and these ideas that basically invoke concepts from Indian philosophy, which I know is close to you, Rick. This idea of energy as basically uh, uh, the, uh, the same thing as what we know as the concept of will in Schopenhauer. This so invocation of these Indian concepts, Eastern philosophical concepts, which nobody really expected at that time, at that point in European philosophy, and which really have informed the large parts of psychodynamic psychotherapy. And if you look at much of Freud's work and later Lacanian psychoanalysis, you see a lot of influences that can be traced back to the ideas articulated by Schopenhauer. So that's my sort of at this stage of my life. That's sort of a kind of a perspective of perhaps taking a step back and looking at the broader philosophical picture.
Yeah, I often think that I need to dive back into many things that I've overlooked in my philosophical education for the same kind of reason. I know these gems are in there, and they were never really emphasized or highlighted in our more formal education as philosophers. But I'm happy to hear that. I'm looking forward to that book, Sasha. Is there anybody else on your list, like Kierkegaard or anybody, on your list of excavating in the future?
Yeah, I'm interested in Max Scheler. Max Scheler is one of the authors that I think has also been unjustly neglected in the regular studies, undergraduate studies of philosophy, at least in Europe. So these kinds of strange Germans, like Scheler and Schopenhauer, both of them were strange Germans in many ways, and both of them were critical of Germany and the German intellectual tradition. But again, on a deeper level, they were so German and so productive and so inspiring. But basically, this book that we are talking about today is really, I think, a bridge between those concepts. It's a book that really plays with those concepts of virtue, habit, identity, the community, all of these concepts that Scheler and Schopenhauer and Hume and many others really made the foundations of their practical philosophy, of their ethics. Okay, Scheler didn't believe that was capable of devising an ethics, and even when he talked about sympathy, he believed that sympathy could not be a foundation of ethics, but it ended up being the foundation of an extremely influential ethics. So these are the sort of things from the classic that sort of excite me and enthuse me. Now that the energy, the youthful energy is slowly sipping away, and some other kind of sort of more meditative perspectives tend to set in our work.
Yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that, because I saw a good chunk of that interest in the book. So this is a good segue. Next question: why did you write this book?
Well,
why is this book important to you? What was your enthusiasm that drove you? This is a big project, and this is a really rich intensely well-argued book. The book is a really long, complex argument. I think it's really impressive, the work that you did here. So I imagine that it took a lot of work on your part. I just want to build that into the question.
Yes, initially I was asked to write this book by the book series editor at Raman and Littlefield, and I sort of was thinking about it for a while, and then somehow it started flowing. The whole thing, the whole project was sort of spontaneous. It was a lot of work, but it sort of went easily. It's one of those projects that go easily, go spontaneously. They do take time, and you do need to go and back and revise and do all of that stuff that's normally gritty and difficult. But in this case, it wasn't so difficult, perhaps because I felt that this was supposed to be some kind of a summary of what I really believed. And I remember being convinced while I was writing this book that this was going to be the last one, that I was not going to write anything after that. And obviously it turned out to be a false assumption. But it wasn't difficult. It was fairly easy. And basically I felt the need to sort of summarize it for myself, to summarize my own views and my own personal experiences and my own sort of brief vision of philosophy and philosophical counseling, and in a way which this book is really is for me.
Yeah, that lands. Yeah, that kind of makes sense, because my sense in reading it was that it came out of your identity itself, like I said earlier. So, yeah, and but I have to just say, there's so much knowledge that you've shared in that book. The way that you connect things is very insightful and illuminating. So, just another plug to everybody to read Virtue as Identity. All right, so speaking of which, next question. Can you give us your overview of the book? What's
Yes.
the main argument or the main thesis or the purpose, the goal? What do you want people to believe walking away from that book?
Yes, the main idea of the book is that our collective identity, our sense of our belonging to our community, whether it's our political community, our family, our value community, our professional community, that our sense of our belonging to the community is fundamentally determined by the way in which that community projects virtue. That the identity of any community is predicated upon the community's conception of a virtue, and that every society projects a certain type of virtue, like an ideal neighbor, an ideal citizen, an ideal soldier. This is a Platonic thing, with those virtues that are associated with social roles. And I think that our identity is fundamentally dependent on our assumption of a particular type of virtue. When we describe ourselves, we try to relate our personalities and our character and our life to particular virtues, and we often do that unconsciously. We often do that in a way which we are not aware of, but other people see that when we try to explain ourselves. So the main concept that the book is built on is that when we talk about identity, both individual and collective, and especially about collective identity, what we talk about is basically about virtue ethics. And that any community, when it wants to look at the core values, at the core mechanisms that keep it together, should really look for the ideas about virtue, not necessarily the formal ideology or the views of the dominant current affairs or dilemmas in society, or even moral issues, but the deeper concept of virtue. What does it mean to be an American today? Look at the divisions in the American society today. Look at the way in which the society is now torn apart into at least two pieces, right? Socially and politically and intellectually. And you can easily explain that in the concept of what for each of those parts, of those torn apart pieces of this society virtue is. What does it mean to be a good American? What does it mean to be a good citizen? What does it mean to be a decent human being? What does it mean to have an honest election? What does it mean to have procedurally correct social interactions, and members of these two political communities, those two people who live on those two sides of this political cleavage within the American society, will all genuinely believe that their concept of what it is to be honest, what it is to be fair, what it is to be great, right, as a nation, is authentic. And this is why their identities are different. because the concepts of virtue are different. And this is why it's dangerous, because it is authentic. It is dangerous and it can lead to a conflict. Political conflict and any other type of conflict. And look at the situation in Europe. Now, Europe is struggling with its concept of identities, with its deep-seated sense. Let me be a psychoanalyst for a brief moment. With a deep-seated sense of insufficiency, of incompetence, inability to deal with serious crises, and at the same time with this idea that somehow, as the chief European diplomat Borrell recently unfortunately phrased it, with this idea of it being a garden, a garden where the rest of the world is the jungle, which is a ridiculous concept. Obviously, Europe is in no way a garden. If anything, it's a jungle compared to many other parts of the world. But these concepts, these ideas, in a way, naively show how we perceive our collective identity, and sometimes it is ridiculously inappropriate, as is the case with this Borrell's concept, which is shared by many Europeans. But generally, our concept of virtue, of who we are, determines the way in which we live our lives. And we can sort of walk past major realities of life. We can walk past major tragedies, such as this one in Palestine at the moment. And we can walk past all kinds of atrocities and human suffering without properly noticing it, if our concept of virtue, if our concept of our own identity is sufficiently strong, a sufficiently strong guiding light, sort of to attract all of our attentions. And so basically we are led by those lights, by those concepts of virtue and collective identity past life's realities. And it is a part of the job for philosophy to sort of persuade us to turn away our gaze from those guiding lights, to sort of critically examine the concepts of virtue that determine our perceptions of ourselves and our communities, and to sort of force ourselves in a way to look at those realities and those things that we are passing by and not noticing. So sort of a critical, the book is attempting to be a critical sort of reflection on how we normally live our lives as members of the community, and a critical reflection on how we perceive virtue in ways that will militate against our ability to be constructive interlocutors of many other people and many other communities.
Wow. Yeah, it's very inspiring. Excellent work, Sasha. I need to read that book 3 times because it's so rich. Now, I had alerted you in advance that these would be my general questions, and one of my questions would be, would you like to sketch the chapters? But I'm not sure if you want to go through that. That might be tedious and that might give away too much. I leave that choice up to you. If you want to do that, we can go and do that. And you could just go through your table of contents and give me a paragraph summary of each chapter. You could do that if you like, but I don't want to force you to do that sort of tedious. It's up to you.
Well, let's spare the audience the experience on having to go through that. But
Okay,
let me say instead that there was an interesting paper written by American psychologist. Unfortunately, last year he was deceased, Louis Charland, who wrote a small paper on personality disorders, specifically on what psychologists call cluster B personality disorders. These are the specific 4 personality disorders that are particularly controversial in psychotherapy: the narcissistic, the borderline, the antisocial, and the histrionic personality disorders. And Charland sort of shook the whole establishment of psychology by saying that cluster B personality disorders are not clinical disorders, they are moral disorders, exclusively moral disorders.
Yeah, this is in one of the earlier chapters of the book, if I recall.
Yes.
Went through this in some detail.
One of his arguments in favor of this thesis was that if you look at the actual diagnostic criteria for the cluster B personality disorders, you don't see any clinical criteria, all of them are moral. And this is an interesting context, which basically brings us to this question that you mentioned earlier about the philosophical nature of psychotherapy, the relationship between psychotherapy and philosophy, where basically a lot of the conceptual apparatus in psychotherapy and psychodiagnostics and in psychology is really mistakenly presented philosophical content. It is a philosophical content that is basically presented in the guise of clinical content. And a lot of the work that are referred to in this book is really in that vein. It is really about that kind of conceptual game playing, with philosophical concepts which basically give rise to psychotherapeutic conceptualizations and classifications. And then, after that, after Challand, you get the new Lacanians such as Jonathan Redmond and others, Paul Verhaag famously, who then say that personality disorders, in fact, are completely fictitious diagnoses, that they have been politically, they have been the result of a political decision to reduce the incidence of the diagnosis of what was previously called latent and non-manifest schizophrenia. So basically what they are saying, the new Lacanians, is that the personality disorders today would have been diagnosed 30 years ago before the famous Gunderson's reform of psychotherapists, nosology, DSM nosology, DSM classification. They would have been diagnosed as schizophrenia. So you have all these strange twists and turns in the concepts in psychotherapy, which bring us back to the philosophical discourse, because they basically bring us to this perspective where you say, okay, let's not talk about schizophrenia. Let's not talk about personality disorders. Let's not talk about these fluffy concepts which tend to transform into each other and which tend to be, the results of various political decisions. Let us talk about what really takes place in these experiences, in these life situations, philosophically. And then you get Peter Rabe with his famous work, about schizophrenia and the philosophical concepts in psychotherapy, and I think a lot of what happens today in psychotherapy is basically an integrative process which brings the entire psychotherapy back to philosophy. Just as at the beginnings of philosophical counseling, philosophical practitioners had problems with psychologists because there was a kind of turf war, a sense of the defensiveness and trying to defend one's profession against the intrusion by another one. My experience, fortunately, has been the opposite. It has been the one of psychotherapists and psychiatrists sort of striving to become more philosophical. So in our training programs, we've always had this issue where we had too many psychologists and too many psychiatrists trying to be in the training and too few philosophers. Well, at one stage, I started asking myself whether this was because we were insufficiently philosophical in the way we did things. But I think the answer is probably that the psychotherapists and psychiatrists who really do their jobs conscientiously and seriously, they do tend to become more philosophers. They do tend to there's some kind of evolution of the methodology within the psychotherapy which makes the whole theoretical thinking more integrative. And it seems to me that this book and the concepts that basically leading lights within this book, leading threads, that they are merely following this logic of the development of psychotherapy, that they are merely sort of riding on that wave of what I feel is the natural tendency, natural dynamics of psychotherapy becoming more philosophical, coming back under the sort of within the embrace of philosophy.
Psychology was a child of philosophy to begin with, and now it's coming back into the family again, so to speak. One of the things I think that made it intuitive for me, reading the book about that connection, was your pointing out how the symptoms on the DSM for these class B or whatever you call them, personality disorders, I forget the category name, a lot of them are the same symptoms for moral deficits. And moral issues are certainly philosophical ones. That was just fascinating to me, the way that you just kind of really seem to put your finger on exactly the relationship between mental health and mental illness and philosophical or moral health, virtue, the individuation and integration of a healthy person, that relationship in the state soul analogy, your version of the Platonic metaphor there. If Alfred North Whitehead read your book, he said, philosophy, the history of philosophy is nothing but a series of footnotes to Plato. I think the first footnote would be to your book, or that this is one of the most important footnotes, because, in the law, by the way, when lawyers want to appeal to a case, a precedent, right? One of the things they do in the United States anyway, they have a book called Shepard's Citations, and they'll look up a case, Jones versus Smith. And there's ROAM, the paralegals have to do this for the lawyers usually. Was it reversed, R, overturned, O, affirmed, A, or M, modified, right? So your book, to me, let's see, does it reverses the order of reasoning in that analogy. It doesn't overturn it, but it kind of affirms it and modifies it.
Thanks very much, Vic. That's
no, I think it's brilliant. I just absolutely, this is so rich. I say this to people so many times. So people who sometimes don't like an analogy because they don't like the point that the analogy is trying to make will point to some disanalogous element of the analogy. And when that happens, that's kind of like a faulty objection to an analogy. I will often do this simple introductory thing where I explain what are analogies for. They're not proofs. They try to take you from the side of the analogy where you can see a characteristic, an element, or whatever, and then show you how it's parallel to this other thing so that it's in the case where you didn't see it. It's just to guide insight. And this is really brilliant. Like I said, this is for the audience who hasn't read the book. That insight and that analogy drives so much. You use that methodology like all over that book, and I just found it really impressive.
Thanks very much. You mentioned the symptom, and there's an even more interesting understanding of the symptom, which is related to this, by Paul Verhaag. Well, basically, when he talks about the symptom in psychotherapy, he argues why psychotherapy is basically a nominalist, as he says, a nominalist perspective, which is fundamentally philosophical. And as a clinical practitioner, he argues that psychotherapy has nothing to do with medicine whatsoever. And one of the arguments that he uses is that analysis of the symptom, because he says, look at the symptom in psychodiagnostics, in psychotherapy, and look at the symptom in medicine. The way in which psychotherapy treats the symptom is directly the opposite to the role of the symptom in medicine, because in medicine, the symptom is something that you need to get rid of. The symptom is a sign of the disease, and one of the reliable indicators that you are progressing with the treatment of the disease is that the symptom subsides and eventually disappears. Whereas in psychotherapy, the symptom is a compensation. It is basically the reaction of the healthy part of the personality to an experience that cannot be constructively psychologically metabolized. So it compensates. This is why psychotherapy talks about compensations. So the goal of psychotherapy is not to uncritically remove the symptom, because if you remove the symptom, you may plunge the person into complete decompensation, into catatonia. So symptom plays a different role. And then he goes on, he says, in medicine, the symptom is something which is particular, and the illness is something that is general. The symptom is something that points to an underlying reality, which is the illness. Whereas in psychotherapy, the symptom is the general, and various disorders can reflect in the same symptom. And it is a matter for the philosophical, basically conceptual analysis of the symptom to interpret the way in which the symptom is a healthy person's response, compensation, if you want, the economical way to deal with something that could otherwise be destructive for the personality. So basically, he uses this idea of the symptom to destroy the very concept of psychotherapy as being somehow medical, and to sort of push it to the other side, to see it as primarily theoretical, primarily philosophical.
Yeah, which is quite ironic because the alleged superiority of psychotherapy over philosophical counseling is that it's on the medical model, right? It has the good status of being medicine. Yeah, but it's ignoring the etiology, right? Just masking the symptom or providing some functional way of handling the symptom or something like that. All right. Well, before I turn it over to Q&A for the audience, is there anything else you would like to share while you have the floor?
Let's have the questions. I like the
All right.
question.
All right. So give me a moment to change and remove the spotlights from everybody, you and I, just momentarily so I could see any hands. So floor is open. Everybody, I think, has the power to unmute yourself. You can raise your hand physically, or you could hit the little, what is it called, raise hand button, or in reactions there might be a hand that you could pick on, and I'll try and remember who goes first. Okay, Lisa Lotte. Oh, good to see you. I didn't realize you were here. Please, Lisa Lotte, could you turn your camera on?
Well, it's late, but okay.
Thank you. Lisa Lotte is hailing in from Austria, if I'm correct. Is that correct, Lisa Lotte?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Hi.
Good to see you.
Hi.
Hi, Alisa.
So I just wanted to add something to the last claim about the difference between psychotherapy and the medical approach to the physical illness. And I would say it's not so different in a way, because one of the big concerns or criticisms to the Western medicine is that it just suppresses the symptoms, right? And the symptoms are a way of the body to get in balance, or to get in a homeostasis, and it creates even more problems very often if you just try to fight the symptom, which is a suppression very often. So that's came to mind, and just wanted to add that from my perspective. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, this is a very important idea. Thank you very much. And this brings me to this, if I may, brings me to this question about the role of sacrifice by the psychotherapist or the philosophical counseling or any kind of helping professional, a role of personal sacrifice, personal investment in the process of helping the client. And we look at the clients who have gone into serious mental disorders because they faced situations in life which they couldn't deal with. And this is like a situation where I think Anders Lindstedt has a metaphor about that, which I often recollect. It's like a man who goes along a road, the road being life, and at a certain point he arrives at a fallen tree. And the tree is huge, it's blocked the road, and it's difficult to climb over. One can't continue. So one leaves the road and goes into the bushes and tries to go around the tree. And one gets lost in the bushes. And the night falls and it becomes cold, and one gets hungry and one starts crying. And then how do you help that person? You can give them antidepressants or antipsychotics and they will stop crying for a while. You can suppress the symptoms. But the only way to actually help them is to leave the road yourself, go into the bushes, listen to the cries, and risk losing yourself in that wilderness, trying to find the person, take them by the hand, and bring them back to the road. And I think that's something that many psychotherapists don't fully appreciate. They don't fully appreciate the fact that psychotherapy, just like philosophy, philosophical counseling, are not professions. They are basically callings. There are ways of life. And that the standards of professionalism, the face-to-facedness, if you want, the formats of the length of sessions, and the things, the principles that you don't think about the client when he's not or she's not there. All of these principles don't really apply a real psychotherapy, a real philosophical counseling, because our clients, as Reverend Yalom once said, he was talking about Thanksgiving dinner with his wife, and he in one of his books, I no longer recollect which one, and he said, when I came finally, I was late for Thanksgiving dinner, and my wife said to me, "You don't really care about your family are your patients." And I said to my wife, "Well, how can you say something like that, dear?" And I thought to myself, how right you are. So basically, you live with other people. You sort of adopt other people. You invest yourself in other people. You go and look for them. You seek them. You search for them. You risk for them. And this results in companionships, in relationships, in particular types of friendships which can't be dissected and classified into what is proper and what is improper, and what is professional, what is unprofessional. You can professionalize the suppression of symptoms, as you said. You can professionalize this concept of medically dealing with the symptoms, but you can't professionalize saving someone from the wilderness, can you?
Yes, and what's just one sentence. I think you also have to, as you said, the values you have or the virtues that you want to express. And it's also a political issue. That's what I wanted to say, because there are two kinds of therapy in psychotherapy. You can bring people back to normal, right? And fit them into society and adjusting them, or you can help them to become their own authorities, or to become independent. And that's probably what you suggest, the second version, not to fit them in as the primary goal, but to help them to deal with the jungle of life in a way. And you can only go so far as you have experienced it yourself to a degree, I would say. So
Yeah.
I have talked enough. Thank you.
Yeah, but do you think that in order to be a good therapist or a good counselor, you need to love your clients? Do you need to create this bubble of love between yourself and the clients?
Not necessarily a personal love, but some kind of transpersonal love and a kind of friendship.
Yes. I've recently faced this situation in my own work, because I suddenly discovered that I was increasingly working with criminals. An increasing number of my clients were criminals, including violent criminals, the loan sharks and people like that, they were. We would go through the course of therapy, and then they would recommend me to a colleague, a friend, and then I would increasingly get calls from people from that kind of underworld. And I discovered that suddenly a large number, relatively large, I don't work with many clients, but a large proportion of the few clients that I work with were criminals, and that this situation had developed because I enjoyed working with them. And then I asked one of them why they were they would get together, and talk about whatever they do. And I don't necessarily want to know what it is. And then they would discuss their problems and suggest to one another that, I would be able to perhaps help them. And then I asked one of them why this was happening. And he said to me, "Because we see that you love us," which is really strange, because I don't have the subjective feeling that I love them. But apparently people feel that.
If you are really interested in people, they feel it as love.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very rare. So
yeah, you're right.
I think that's great that you do that and did that.
Thank
with
you.
them. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you, Lisa Lotte. Anybody else? Mike, you made a comment in the chat box. Did you want to share a thought with the rest of us? And then someone else also put a comment in there.
I would have to say that as just a fly on the wall here, it's that I see commonality in a lot of the things that you're talking about in some of my Asian studies. And Confucianism is certainly a philosophy that certainly gives us identity through its virtues. So I would say that, studying the other side of the world kind of completes the picture, at least for me. Thanks.
Yes, and Confucianism also insists on the community, right? And on a sense of collective virtue, right, rather than individualism. And it talks about all of the virtues, including moderation and loyalty and solidarity, primarily in social terms, not in terms of individual achievement.
Yeah, when I was reading the book, I felt throughout much of it that this was totally resonant with Confucianism. Yeah, fascinating. Russell Johnson, are you still here? Because you put something in the chat about Buddhist virtues. Did you want to share that with Sasha or with the rest of us? You're trying to figure out how to unmute, Russell? There should be a little picture of a microphone.
Yeah, I'm unmuted now.
Yeah, great.
No, I just when you mentioned the word virtue, and after practicing Buddhism for many years, it just brought up the four virtues right away. So I figured I'd share that with you guys, and it's all about I think the virtues. As we change poison into medicine, as we grow as individuals, as we start to see ourselves, as 100%, we don't have to sell ourselves short. I believe in the virtue of overcoming one's destiny, for sure. That's my take on it. I can't wait to. I'm just starting out on my reading back again, and I look forward to reading the book that has been talked about today. It's just fascinating, very fascinating. That's all.
When you say virtue as a way of overcoming destiny, that's really interesting. Destiny. I mean, how do you see that? How do you see destiny?
Well, I go back to the teachings from Tsunembero Makaguchi and Jose Toda, the first two presidents of the Soka Gakkai, who felt that doing one's human revolution by tapping the inner Buddha nature, which is, I feel, based on a philosophy. Buddhism, in my view, is a philosophy that always seemed quite an interesting way to overcome the sufferings that we all face in the world. We all face a birth, old age, sickness, and death, parting from those we love, associating with those we dislike, not attaining what we desire, and the physical and mental component issue that you talk about a lot about. I think we all have shortcomings, and we all have things that we want to overcome, and I think destiny is a big part of it.
Yes, Russell. That's a great perspective, because I think Schopenhauer has a very relevant understanding of destiny here, which is aligned with Buddhism to some extent. I think he says there's no free will in the sense that I can choose what to do. I mean, what I will do has been predetermined in much the same way as a swinging stick. Once I swing a stick, which which stands by the wall, you know, the moment I swing it, depending on the forces, the strength of the swing, you know, the resistance of the air, whatever forces, it's predetermined to which side the stick will fall. But while it's swinging, it gives me this tension, this impression that it can fall to either side. But you know,
Yes.
this is the same with our character. It says our decisions are determined, Schopenhauer believes, by two factors: by our character and by the motives, by the specific motives and interests of the moment. And he says it is predetermined what I will do, but I don't know it. So it's important for me to try to discover what material I'm made of, what stuff I'm made of, and what kind of a character I am. And through my life, I discover, I sort of demonstrate my character, and sometimes I surprise myself by my decisions by showing to myself who I am. And the only way to get away from this causality, from this chain of predetermination, is the Buddhist way, and it is sort of quietening, you know, and sort of reducing the strength of the will to life in yourself, and sort of achieving this point of immobility. And then he makes explicit references to the Veda, you know, and the Upanishads, where he basically explains how the Indian philosophy understood this way of sort of getting away from the causality and predetermination. I think this is very much what we do, especially when we become more mature and more experienced in psychotherapy. This is increasingly what we find ourselves doing with our clients, explaining to them how to do nothing, how not to do something in order to achieve something. It sounds paradoxical, but somehow we find ourselves increasingly in those roles. At least it seems to me that way.
I have to say a few things here because you brought up free will, and this is, of course, one of the things that torments me as a person and a philosopher. But I saw, speaking of the Vedas and whatnot, I went to get the blessing, they call it a darshan in Indian philosophy, of a holy woman who is a friend of one of my first meditation teachers who came here recently, and she gave a lecture, and in her lecture, her guru rejects free will very explicitly. And she said, you might think that, you know, you're making choices and everything of your free will on some level, conventionally speaking, but it's all pre-willed. So your free will is pre-willed, right? That was what she said. And I'm not so sure I agree with this, but, you know, I don't want to get into a big debate here. But there's something like a performative contradiction I sense in the view, and you peddle this view in the book, that, well, I would agree with this part of it. Much of the influences that form our character and therefore inform our choices are, you know, massive. They're cultural, they're conditional, environmental, political, all those different things during the formative years. So by the time you cultivate a character, you're a kind of agent. You know, this is part of virtue ethics, right? Well, the kind of agent that you are is going to determine the choices that you make, et cetera, et cetera. But is there no agency? If there's no agency, what's the point of all these prescriptions? If I may ask you that.
Schopenhauer would say that sometimes I can arrive at what has been predetermined only through a struggle. It has been predetermined that I have to go through the struggle of attaining virtue in order to do what my authentic personality entails that I must do. I can fall short of what has been meant for me if I don't follow the precepts of the struggle and you know the process, which when it's looked at from the outside seems to be somehow unequivocally connected to an uncertainty, to an open-endedness, to some situation where you fight to do this rather than that. You will do this either way. But you need to fight for it in order to sort of implement the qualities of your personality. You need to do it in the difficult way because that's the way it's meant sometimes, and sometimes it goes easy. I mean, for me, this book was easy. That's why I mentioned at the beginning. It was the easy way. So I don't take much credit for it because it happened by itself. It was predetermined in a very easy way.
But Sasha, you still get the profits when people buy this book, no? It wasn't the will of the universe that wrote the book. The will of the universe should get the profit. Well, wait, I don't want to debate free will. We'll be here forever. But so let me change the view back. So I got.
Let me just say hello to Vona. Hello, Vona, and hello,
Yes. Hi,
Miriam.
Vana.
Miriam, hello as well.
Hello. Hello
Haven't
to
seen
everybody.
Vona
I was
for
so
quite a
sorry I
long
was
time.
late, Sasa. I was detained, but it's wonderful to see you again.
It's great to see you. Thank you for being here.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, maybe another way of not getting lost in the paradox of doing and not doing is this brilliant book by Edward Slingerland, Trying Not to Try. He's a Taoist. I don't know if you read it. It's a fascinating study. He goes through the whole history of all the debates around these ideas. Yeah, and I think one of the distinctions in Buddhism that might be helpful for me in trying to reconcile these two views is that they make this distinction between ultimate reality or ultimate truth and conventional reality or conventional truth. So maybe on some ultimate level, Schopenhauer is right, and we're not individuals, we're individuals, and we're kind of part of these. What is that other person who calls it? Hyper objects. We're connected with the whole interdependent net of all things, the universe, nature with a capital N, whatever, on the ultimate level. But on the conventional pragmatic level, I'm responsible for my choices and I have to make efforts, like you said. And I think that you wouldn't function well as an agent if you didn't presuppose that your agency mattered. So that doesn't necessarily mean you have free will in the sense that the libertarian, not the political libertarian, the metaphysical libertarian thinks you're a totally autonomous kind of soul that injects causes into the world and is never influenced or caused by them. I don't know. Not many people believe that. But that's all I'll say is I think that those two things, trying not to try, that whole way of thinking about things, and then they call it the two truths, this distinction in Buddhism. And Wilfrid Sellars made a similar distinction in Western philosophy between, what did he call it? The manifest image, which is the common sense view of the world that manifests phenomenologically in our everyday experience and our pragmatic use of language, as opposed to scientific language and scientific concepts. Right? We don't go to the grocery store and give a long list of atomic propositions to get a sandwich, right? We just ask for a sandwich, right? But a sandwich is composed of all sorts of scientifically reducible quarks and things like that. It's just impractical, right? So pragmatically, and that's where the performative contradiction, I think. William James, I'll say this one other thing, he was seriously depressed, like psychologically ill from thinking he had no agency. And he says that the first act of free will of his, which cured him of his mental illness, was to believe that he had free will and start acting as if he did. So that's what I'm talking about. I don't want people to think that they should just, okay, you fell off the boat, the Titanic, and you'll either survive or you won't. So don't even make an effort to try, because then you're definitely going to drown, unless some big sea turtle or a dolphin comes by. Then it was the will of God. All right, that's all I'll say about that. All right.
Schopenhauer uses the metaphor, which I think Whitehead also mentioned at one stage. You mentioned Whitehead. But Schopenhauer uses the metaphor of a waterfall when he describes the will, the thing in itself, the substance of reality. A waterfall is like a picture of what happens in terms of predetermination, and every drop of water there struggles and has its own drama. And yet the whole waterfall, it cascades and it goes on the way it goes. And at every cascade, there's the struggle, there's the fight, there's the sense of indeterminacy, but there's an overarching determination, which basically decides how the waterfall will happen, will be shaped. Right?
Yeah, that view can be called compatibilism, right? The individual molecules have some agency, but that's massively predetermined.
Yeah.
So they're both kind of true on different levels with different ways of looking. Mike, you've made a couple comments. Did you want to come back with sharing them in the chat?
I just wanted to ask Sasha, does your definition of virtue land in absolutism or relativism?
What exactly do you mean by that?
You have a week? I guess in absolutism is that it's the morality of the virtue is unchangeable. It's innate. It's always there. And in relativism, it's more of a social construct. So something can be virtuous in one society and not virtuous in another. So did I explain myself very well?
Yes. The reason I asked you what you meant by it was because I never could really understand how what Kant considers the absolutist concept of virtue could apply to any society. Is there any society where there is an absolutist concept of virtue? I mean, we learn what virtue is. We don't know what virtue is. We don't have a concept, the vaguest concept of virtue until we are socialized. So, according to Lacanian psychoanalysis, for example, the very concept of normalcy, psychological normalcy, is predicated upon socialization. It says the way in which I can be healthy, mentally healthy, according to Lacan, is by having a clear concept of what he calls the primary signifier, and for him this he calls name of the father, the figure of the father, the figure of the hierarchical structure which socializes me. In the bourgeois society of Lacan's time, fathers were those who socialized children, and mothers brought children from the young age. They basically offered them warmth and unconditional love. And there was a division of labor within the family. So this concept of name of the father was the substance, the primary criterion of normalcy, according to Lacan. And then he says, how do you distinguish between neurosis and psychosis? He says neurosis is when the name of the father, the concept of socialization, is blocked. So you don't relate to challenges arising from your society in a productive way. So you're neurotic. And psychosis happens when socialization is absent, when it's canceled, when the concept of the father, of socialization, of authority, of hierarchy, of rules is alien to you, and you fantasize your own reality. In a lot of the psychotherapeutic tradition, the concept of virtue is associated with the concept of psychological health and normalcy, and is based on the idea of socialization. Now, the Kantian absolutist idea of virtue would be some rational construction which would be universal, which would be based on the idea that in each situation you have a reliable criterion on how to decide what is morally right and what is morally wrong. But even Kant doesn't call it virtue. Kant calls it a categorical imperative. He calls it the moral justification of actions, but he doesn't call it virtue. It seems to me that virtue in itself, as a semantic concept, involves this idea, this Lacanian idea of sociality, what George Agamben calls socialitas, sociality, right? As an element of virtue, yeah.
Mike, do you want to follow up with that?
What struck me was that a question popped into my mind while you were speaking, is that can an individual, a castaway on an island, be virtuous? Or do we have virtue is only contained in social structure?
Yes, well, let me answer with a question. Can an individual cast on an island be normal, be psychologically healthy? Would we be able to distinguish between a mentally healthy and a mad individual if it was only one individual on an island?
My opinion, and I don't have the data to prove it, but my opinion that yes, you can keep your sanity in isolation.
Yes, but how would you explain the sanity? I mean, the sanity traditionally in psychotherapy, in all lines of psychotherapy, in all contexts of psychotherapy, sanity is interpreted in the context of our relationship to the other, as
Well,
you know, as
I
a
would say,
relationship.
I would say that I guess my definition of sanity would be do no harm to self.
Mhm.
Let me interject too. I can imagine somebody on, a desert island somewhere that goes around torturing animals and killing plants that it could eat and whatnot, and behaving in irrational and self-destructive ways, as a kind of illustration of what Mike is hinting at. Right? That Sasha, I could imagine that somebody who had cultivated a virtuous character could maintain it even in the absence of other human beings around them, if they didn't
Yes, that's for
deviate.
sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's for sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but still, I think the way you perceive normalcy or psychological mental disturbance or virtue or lack of virtue is always predicated upon there being something else. Animals, plants, something else.
Right.
Which
Right.
is the
Yeah. If you were hooked up
something that
to,
is the referent of your internal normativity, of your intentionality. Let's go back to Searle. Everything, all mental states are intentional states in a healthy person. So if you deprive the person of the prerogatives of intentionality, of the otherness, of the referential objects, you lose the context within which you can assess virtue, right? Theoretical, but this is very difficult to achieve.
I think this is one of the things that Aristotle got right about the fact that we're, among other things, we're social beings by nature. That's our identity. One of his quotes in the Nicomachean Ethics was that no man, though he could have all other goods, would choose to live without friends. Right? So the absence of social intercourse is a deprived state. You might be able to hold out and maintain your character if the conditions of your existence in that environment allowed for it. But there would be a great loss to identity over time, the longer that lasts. But I think of Viktor Frankl. Not only he was in a worse state than just being on an island, he was in a hell, being kind of tormented and tortured, and maintained his psychological health and his moral health. So I don't know, Mike. I'm not sure that this is a good thought experiment to solve this question.
I'm just so what I'm hearing is that it sounds like you believe we couldn't live on Walden's Pond. That there is no sanity and sanctity. There's no in isolation. I really think that humans can still flourish in that condition, and that we don't need a social construct to be able. Now, when it comes back to virtue, it's like, we could certainly act not virtuous through chemical changes in our brains and such. So it's just not a reaction to social reinforcement. It can be a biological reaction. So I'm sorry, I'm kind of going around in circles.
Yeah, but if you talk to monks who live alone,
Exactly.
most of them will tell you that they are not alone, that they are with God. And a lot of the writings that they produce about their experience of loneliness basically talk about the loneliness being an opportunity to dedicate all their time to prayer and to their relationship with God. There's a significant otherness in their life. There is an intentionality of their mental states. So the other doesn't have to be physically another person which is there next to us, but there needs to be a referential object for our mind to function in a virtuous way, it seems to me.
And that's like the Taoist monks that live in huts in solitude, is that their relationship, their other, is with Tao. So just, different concept. But yes, I believe you have to have connection, or that meaning of life is extinguished. So if meaning of life is extinguished, that could get back to our mental health again, is that then we lose our mental health.
Yes, and this is where we go back to Frankl, which he has a specific, when he describes his experience in the concentration camp. He says there's one single major difference that decided whether somebody will survive or not, in most cases. People who survived, in most cases, were people who had someone who was waiting for them and had something to go back to. And people who gave up and didn't survive, didn't, in most cases. And when he talks about himself, he had lost his unborn child, his wife, and his parents. And he had stayed in Germany in order to protect his parents. He had the opportunity to go to America. He had a visa to leave before, just before he was arrested by the Gestapo. And he says, so he had nowhere to go back to. And he says, the only thing that kept me alive was the unfinished manuscript of my book, which I had hidden with me. And the moment when I was the closest, if you remember, the closest to death in the camp, was the moment when they found the manuscript and took it away. Right?
Yeah, I'm wondering if those Buddhist monks who don't believe in a self and who, there's two kinds of Buddhists, the ones who want to simply become enlightened and cease to be separate and vanish into whatever this negative conception of reality that nirvana represents for them. And then the other ones are the ones who take the vow, the bodhisattvas, to stay around and postpone disappearing into the void until all other sentient beings are free from suffering, right? So I know that at least the bodhisattvas have others when they're in the cave for 20 years meditating to become, enlightened beings. But I wonder about the ones who just want to become enlightened and exit the game. Well, maybe they have such a vision of value that they perceive enlightenment as the good, the true, the beautiful, or something like that. And that's the equivalent of God for them, even though they have a negative kind of metaphysics about it. Negative, I don't mean in morally negative, I mean in terms of metaphysical substantiality, it's apophatic rather than cataphatic, that kind of thing. I don't know, it's just raising a curious question in my mind for Mike there.
Yeah. Whether the otherness for them, the referential point is the goal. The goal of getting off
the wheel of birth and death. Yeah, and enlightenment is perceived as the summum bonum. It is perceived as the greatest good.
Yeah.
So that's good enough, I guess. Yeah. All right. Well, as we have about 5 minutes left, let me get my gallery view again and see if anybody else has any questions or comments. Russell, it looks like you're trying to find your speaker again. Well, anybody else while we wait for Russell to figure out how to unmute? Oh, I see another Aleksandar here who I met last summer. Hi, good to see you.
How's it?
Hi, good to see you too.
Thank you. So Russell Johnson, did you unmute? I can't tell.
I think can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but we don't see. Oh, there. For a moment we saw you, but it's more important that we hear you.
Now it was both.
Okay. No, it's one or the other, apparently.
Yeah.
Shut your camera off. We only have 4 minutes left, or 5 minutes, so. Nope. Once again, while we wait for him, if there's anybody else. Well, I don't know. Maybe Russell, if you want to just type a question or comment, because we're still not hearing you. I'm not sure this is going to resolve, Russell. So we might have to just move on. And if we hear from you before we end this, I'll try to get back to you.
I think I just unmuted myself now.
Okay, good. Don't change anything. Talk. Are you still there?
Yeah, I think I'm still around.
Yeah.
Okay, we can still hear you. Do you have a question or a comment?
Okay, let me comment on this. I want to share with you. They say that I was reading an essay the other day, and they talked about it. The quote was, "When one's soul achieves a victory, his sadness becomes a part of his compassion. And when you are in the deepest suffering, when you feel miserable, sad, and worried, that is the time you embrace yourself with your own compassion. When you do so, sadness will turn into courage, and hopelessness will be replaced by hope. A person who is capable to be compassionate for himself or herself in a time of own suffering can regard other people's sadness like his own and is able to embrace these people with compassion." I think that, I think we have to fundamentally respect our own lives and the lives of others. I think this concept of nirvana being on top of the mountain is far-fetched. I think Buddhism equals daily life. I believe in no discontinuity between past, present, and future. I think that our life force really dictates our present moment, and I think we have to have the determination, I think, to overcome the sufferings of life. Really, I think the reason lies in, I guess, in our culture, in the way we are, and the way we think, and the way we embrace, the teachings that we come across in life. And look, today's been wonderful. I'm just glad I was able to share it and be around you guys today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Russell. It sounded like a little preaching there, but that's good. I would interpret that and say that you were inspired. And I think that if you read the book, you'll be even more inspired, and you'll find a lot of wealth connected with your conception of sadness and empathy and sympathy and compassion, and how they're all related and important in the book in ways that you'll only be able to find out if you buy it and read it. One more plug for your book, Sasha. So look, we're at the end here. We have a minute left. I think it would be a good practice for us to always let the guest plug anything, give their, how to find them, or your website, or anything like, any last thoughts.
Yes, I thank you very much. I mean, I've really enjoyed this session, and thank you for offering your time so selflessly and to being here with me tonight. We do some interesting work at the Institute for Practical Humanities. Our website is www.iph.edu.sr. You can find it through the search very easily.
www.iph.edu, did you say?
edu.rs.
.rs. I just put it in the chat.
Yeah. And basically, we try to combine training in philosophical counseling with psychotherapeutic training, and the very idea of model integrative psychotherapy is really this integration. And the interesting thing here is that it gives rise to all kinds of other programs and courses, some of which can sound rather surprising or sort of intriguing in some ways. And the latest idea that we have is to offer a course on the methodology and philosophy of resting, which is not really the apology of laziness and the philosophy of laziness.
This is part of the philosophy of not doing.
The philosophy of non-doing as a psychotherapeutic methodology.
Yeah.
So if this is only at the beginning, this is only being conceptualized now. So any input, any critique, any ideas would be extremely highly valued, and we would be very grateful. for that.
Thank you so much, Sasha. I'll say one thing. Of late, my meditations have become not meditating. And that's been the kind of instructions that I give when I guide meditations. Just stop trying to meditate.
Right. That's great.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Sasha. This has been wonderful. And thank you, everybody else, for coming. And this recording will probably wind up, you'll get an email to say if you don't approve or anything like that. But most likely you'll have access to this recording at some point, even if it's only internal.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Sasha.
Have a great evening, rest of the day. Take care, everyone.
Great.
Ciao.
Ciao.